Hello and welcome back to Rock, Paper, Shotgun. Now, I think it's fair to say that people really like Baldur's Gate 3. 800,000 people are currently playing it via Steam at the time of recording. It's the highest rated game of all time. That's according to aggregate site Opencritic. My 62-year-old dad asked me about it over the weekend, which honestly is the most impressive accolade a game can receive. The last game he cared about was The Great Escape. Remember that? Of course you don't. Stop lying. Baldur's Gate 3 is exceptional, then. A flexible and dynamic RPG that provides players with a vast fantasy sandbox that reacts to their every decision. Not unlike Dungeons & Dragons, the tabletop RPG it's built upon. Based on the game's 5th edition ruleset, Baldur's Gate 3 aims to replicate the joy of Dungeons & Dragons in video game form. But how successful is it at that monumental task? To discuss this question, I'm joined by Deputy Editor Alice B., who has spent many hours with both Baldur's Gate and Dungeons & Dragons proper. Hello, Alice.
Hello.
Before we dive in properly, you've played a hell of a lot of Baldur's Gate 3, you reviewed it for the site. What are your general impressions of the game?
It's a very good RPG, I would say. It's very good. I gave it a best is best. I think it deserves it. It's detailed, it's a big world, but it's very intentional. There are a lot of crisscrossings, and the story, is very complicated, and there are lots of little tributaries. All the side quests that you find usually lead back into it somehow. So I think it's very good.
I'm very early on, but from the 16 hours I've played, I'm incredibly impressed. And also those 16 hours have disappeared very quickly. Does not feel like I've spent that long playing it.
I would say there are 3 acts. I would say you're probably looking at, depending on whether you hoover up everything, maybe 20 to 25 hours per act, I would say.
Damn, that's a hell of a lot of game to experience. So let's dive right into this general question then. How does Baldur's Gate 3 compare to a real-life game of Dungeons & Dragons, do you think?
I'd say it's the closest, because it's a single-player game primarily, I would say. You can do drop-in, drop-out co-op that works pretty well, but the main difference is that you are on your Todd, and it tries to replicate having pals by your little group of companions. It's a party-based, turn-based system of combat. So you take 3 pals with you every time. And that's about the size of a Dungeons & Dragons group. Usually sort of 4 or 5 players. I've been playing D&D for like 10 years on and off now. I maintain that it is the worst RPG of the tabletop rules out there, the D20 system. But I keep going back. So, and I think Baldur's Gate 3 really, it's the greatest replication of Dungeons & Dragons and the Dungeons & Dragons rule set, and that is for good and ill. So It's fun and adventurous, and you get to make your own character, and you feel like you're building your own story and making your own decisions, and loads of knock-on effects and things. I made friends with a bunch of urchins because I was able to detect one of them was trying to pick my pocket, and I know you didn't, because you didn't have the insight or the perception enough to fail or to succeed at that skill check, So there is that. But at the same time, for all that those kids in Stranger Things bloody love Dungeons & Dragons, there is quite a high barrier to entry that is inherent in Dungeons & Dragons compared to most other RPGs that you will play. I think the combat system and the D20 system is pretty complicated. And I don't think, if there is a criticism that I would have for Baldur's Gate 3, is I don't think it tutorializes especially well. Because it throws a lot at you.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of stuff to... Yeah, how did you find it?
It's really interesting to come at it from the angle of how complicated the fundamental systems of D&D are, because I've played a lot of one-shots, but I only started playing D&D proper this year, and I've only played about 4 sessions over the last couple of months. So there are a lot of rules within D&D that I do find quite confusing that I kind of had to work out myself, because like you say, Baldur's Gate didn't really communicate them incredibly clearly. So I'm playing as a sorcerer, and if you're a magic user in D&D, you have to use a limited resource called spell slots. for your spells, which is a very odd way of putting it. And you need to long rest. So go back to camp, put on your sexy pajamas, eat a couple of legs of deer before you can cast spells again. But you do also have something called cantrips, which are spells that can be performed at any time.
Yeah.
You don't need to refresh them. The word cantrips annoys me because it's so obtuse as a term. So I found going into this game as a spellcaster to be like playing the game in hard mode. So I do agree with what you're saying about the fundamental complexity of D&D makes getting into this game a little bit of a hurdle.
Yeah. And I get like spell slots are basically a way to kneecap magic users, because otherwise you'd just be flinging fireballs and immolating everything all over the place, and it would just basically be unfair and too easy. But it is difficult to get your head around it, and the short rests where you get half your spell slots back and all that kind of bollocks. There's a lot going on, and once you have, I said in my review, once you have a firm grasp of the nettle, the combat is quite fun. But there's not only that, but there's also stuff that you will recognise from stuff like Divinity Original Sin, but there are a lot of status effects and elemental effects, and you can use spells to make the ground difficult to get through. You can electrify water, you can set fire to stuff, you can move things around. Edwin, our news editor, wrote a piece about barrelmancy earlier in the week, so you can stack barrels, you can do all that kind of stuff. In a lot of the combat situations, the best thing to do is to control your party individually, so ungroup them from each other, move the rogue around this side, move the spellcaster here, and do all that before you start the encounter at all. And if you don't know that, and the game doesn't really explain that to you, I think the learning by doing process to figure that stuff out could be a bit painful. And there are some people who are just not going to like it.
No.
At all.
I never played a CRPG before this, so initially I almost had like a revulsion to the screen, the first combat screen I saw, because there were so many buttons on it, and I was like, my brain is just rejecting this. I cannot comprehend what's happening. But I do think because the game fundamentally is so much speedier than a game of D&D, I have learned more about the game than I would have done if I'd just been playing it in its tabletop form.
Yeah.
And I've done like 2 fights across 4 sessions in D&D proper, but obviously in Baldur's Gate I've done maybe 10 at this point. But obviously combat is just one quite small part of Dungeons & Dragons, I'd say. The majority of what I've done in Dungeons & Dragons and in Baldur's Gate has been a lot of conversations and roleplay, a lot of exploring. How do you think Baldur's Gate converts that side of D&D into a video game?
It's an interesting one because it depends on the dungeon master you have, and someone picked me up in my review for saying that combat is about 70% of what you do. I think that especially if you're struggling a little bit with the combat will be most of what you do, in terms of maybe you don't have that many combat encounters, but the combat it takes a little while sometimes, especially if there are loads of people.
I would agree with that.
Yeah. You can, which I think is really good actually, in Baldur's Gate 3, you can talk your way out of encounters or get people to just leave and not have a fight with you and still get the XP, which is not what my DM does in real life. You do not get XP if you don't kill any goblins. But the thing is, if you have a human DM, they can fudge things for you in a way that, so they won't necessarily fudge the number that comes up on the dice. Some DMs in real life will roll behind a screen, and then if they really don't want to kill you, they'll just lie and say they rolled a 14. You don't have to do that, but there are ways you can avoid killing your players or like really screwing them over, or even if they fail a roll, they can sort of one of the others will try and talk them out or whatever.
Yeah.
There are times when that sort of does happen in Baldur's Gate 3, so you like fail a persuasion roll, but you can still kind of get the outcome you want. But there are times where you'll do like, and this happened to both Ed and Graham, you will fail a roll like really early on and you'll just die and you have to like reload.
With the mind flare that's trapped under the girder. Yeah. I also died to that.
Yeah, and if you haven't learned that you should save quite, like basically what that teaches you, and this is a point that Graham made, which I think is very true, it doesn't teach you that mind flayers are dangerous, because you already knew mind flayers are dangerous. You had a whole opening where you learned that mind flayers are dangerous. What that teaches you is that the DM is a prick, so you should save scum, because that could happen at any time. And it is definitely the case that part of the joy of this is that you shouldn't just reload because a fight is going badly. Yeah. If a fight is going badly, you can find ways to get out of it, and it will feel better because you triumphed out of adversity. Mm-hmm. But there are also points, I think, where if it had been a human DM who has a little bit more flexibility than a complicated calculator, that you would get maybe a slightly less disappointing outcome, or it would be a kind of richer way of getting around failed rolls and things like that. That you can't. Sounds like such a wanky soundbite, but there's no substitute for a human mind, Liam. So.
But there is. You are completely correct, right? First of all, just to mention the mind flare that kills you at the start of the game. It says to you, lean in for a little kiss. When am I ever not going to lean in for a little kiss with a squid man? The game punished me for my wanting to have a little kiss with an octopus boy.
Oh,
that's
man.
Not my fault.
Oh,
that's
Liam.
Larian's fault.
Oh, there's going to be, in about 40 hours time, you're going to message me. Anyway, carry on.
Although on the one hand, I think it's really impressive how beautifully crafted this story is, and about the amount of permutations it offers that are as interesting and as well written as all the others. And I think it does a very good job as well of pretending to offer the weirder sidelines and side stories that real life D&D does. Like you're saying, when you're faced with a goblin, and I did this once in D&D, me and a friend were like, let's kill all the goblins, but take one as our son, and we're going to adopt a goblin as our child and call him Slurpee. Like, there are parts of the game that will let you do fun things like that, but there is an obvious rigidity to games that, like you said, the human mind is not prone to. And I do wonder, is that a problem?
I mean, not to the extent that I think it makes the game bad, you know. It's just, it's more just like there are some times when it will feel a bit unfair, because it is a luck-based system, you know, most of it. And the idea is that you build a character to stack towards, you know, being good at certain things. If you've built a character who's not good at persuadey stuff, there are times where you can't switch to the party member who is good at persuadey stuff and have a critical conversation, you know, and you won't know that it was a critical conversation that could use a persuadey person until you're sort of in it. So there's just little things like that. But at the same time, like, when you're playing D&D, I can't swap to someone else's character, but they could step in. Like, I could look at them and give them a nod, you know. So it's not really bad. And I think it does do a really good job of sort of making you feel like you were the only player who has found a dog in the woods who becomes your best mate, you know. Even though every other player who is playing Baldur's Gate 3 can find a dog in the woods and who will become their best mate, you know. But it does make it feel to you like that is a unique event. Yeah. And there's stuff in there that are roads not travelled for me. It does feel like you are creating a sort of unique story as you're playing. I have not done like a big replay yet, so I don't know if it feels less like that the second time around when you're like, the inn's on fire, But on the whole, I do think it is the best recreation of Dungeons and Dragons that anyone has done in video game form, and that includes some of the less good stuff about D&D. But D&D's popular. True. So there you go.
I completely agree. I think by virtue of it feeling like an interactive and reactive campaign that is being made just for you, it is definitely the best conversion of that tabletop RPG that I've certainly played. And I think it's just really good, as do you, because, like you say, you gave it our highest accolade.
Yeah.
Brill. Oh, well, I'd love to hear what everyone in the comments think. If you're a seasoned Dungeons and Dragons player and you're currently adventuring through Baldur's Gate, let us know what you think in the comments below. But thank you so much for joining, Alice. It's always a treat.
Thank you for having me. It's been great. Roll for fun.
Yeah. Oh, nice one. Yep. Critical failure.